It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce Stefan Napel to this audience. I've known him quite a while, more than 20 years in my own count, and I only say a few words briefly about his past. Stefan went to school in Hanover, and but his academic studies began in University of Karlsruhe, where he and also in Trinity College Dublin. He presented his thesis on bilateral bargaining theory and applications, and that was defended in University of Karlsruhe, and that work was published in a series of lecture notes in economics and mathematical systems.
Okay.
He then took up a junior professor position at University of Hamburg, and in 2007 he was nominated the professor of economics, especially microeconomics at University of Bayreuth. He has made a number of research and teaching visits. Primarily his favorite place seems to be Boston, but occasionally he has also ventured all the way to Turku, which I'm very glad to observe. Stefan is a true game theory man. Most of his work is related to game theory, but there are other works as well. He has, when you look at his list of publications, the game theory emphasis is abundantly clear. In addition to tens of articles in scholarly journals and edited volumes on bargaining, power indices, collective choice, transnational institutions, and multi-level systems, he recently joined the Holler-Illing duo in turning out the whopping 8th edition of the Einführung in the Spiel theory. Over the past few years, Napel has entered a new research field in the intersection of cooperative game theory and voting theory. After bravely throwing himself into the surprisingly lively and passionate debate on comparative virtues of various indices of voting power, Napel and his associates shifted their main focus on first to do the two-tier institutions and thereafter to the practically more relevant issue of voting procedures and their impact on power distributions. The dichotomous yes-no voting that underlies the classic measures of voting power was deemed by Napel inappropriate in many real-world voting institutions. The recent work by Napel, Kurz and Meyer has accordingly focused on game presentations of voting procedures in multi-alternative settings. This work is truly pioneering, and I very much hope that today's presentation will at least touch upon this fascinating insight. Suspecting and looking forward to that he will touch upon this theme, it is a great pleasure that I now give the floor to my old longtime friend, Napel.
Yeah, well, many thanks, Hannu. Welcome to everyone. I'm particularly excited that Hannu gave this introduction because he, with both his own presentations and the criticism of my presentations, has been a key instigator of the research program that I want to introduce you to over the next 45 minutes or so. This is joint work, as Hannu mentioned, with Sascha Kurz and Alex Meyer, also from Bayreuth, who are also in the meeting, and I guess happy to take some of the blame if there should be any. Hannu and a few of you have been active long enough to no longer need to serve in all sorts of university committees, but I'm sure you all had your fair share. And so I ask all of you to get into the right mood by imagining you belong to some prize or hiring committee that is to select one of 5 candidates. There's 40 members to the committee, and they are split into 3 homogeneous groups of size 6, 5, and 3. And members of the largest group, they like candidate A the best and B the worst, and then B, C in between. Group 2, 5 members, they prefer B. We got A as the worst choice, and then C, D in between, and so forth for group 3. And then often the most intuitive way to reach a decision in such a setting is to give every member one vote and then simply do a plurality count. And then candidate A would win the prize or be hired since the 6 members, assuming sincere voting according to these preferences, will cast their vote for A. But A doesn't have a majority. I mean, there's 8 versus 6 members not liking A very much, but rather sort of placing the candidate at the bottom. And so someone might call for a runoff between the 2 plurality leaders, A and B, and then B would actually win that runoff, 8-6, in a binary comparison. But then talking about binary comparisons, it turns out that if C is put against B or A, C will win, and in fact C is the Condorcet winner, winning all pairwise comparisons. Or especially if this is a prize committee, the members of the committee might assign scores to the various candidates, and then if they use the border scoring scheme, which is the most famous one, it would be D who turns out the winner. And there's even a 5th procedure, approval voting. Under the right circumstances, E can also be the winner. So in other words, who wins all depends on the procedure in this case. And if you are member of one of the groups and happen to be the chair and have figured out the preferences of the other committee members, then you might reverse engineer which voting rule you want to apply in order to get what you want. However, many voting rules are decided before knowing who will be the prize winner. It's sort of laid out in statutes or bylaws. So the question is, which voting rule would you suggest a priori? If you belong to the large group, in our department, that would be sort of the law guys, and then the second largest would be business, and the smallest group would be economics. Or if you want to help the economists, the small group of 3. Or more generally, what we ask is, what are the a priori implications of different voting rules for the success and influence of stakeholders who wield different vote shares, here corresponding to different group sizes, but this could also just be shareholdings. So the answer should matter for shareholders, meetings of corporations, various councils, supervisory boards, or other types of committees. The issue is not new, of course, and it touches on at least 2 rather disjoint literatures. The first one is the one that also Manfred actively contributed, and I tried to do in the past with, for instance, with Mika Wittgren. That is a priori voting power and sometimes also success. We'll come to the difference later. There's a huge literature on that, but it's all focused, as Hannu said, on dichotomous decisions, binary votes, nothing about 3 candidates or more. There's some extensions of the traditional analysis, incorporating the possibility to abstain or for the committee to be simply tied forever. But there's nothing really going beyond plurality rule, covering plurality runoff or border, or comparing that to binary comparisons of all candidates. So that's literature number 1. We want to extend a bit. The second is much smaller and has actually dealt with comparing plurality with and without runoff and border and all sorts of other rules. It deals with the manipulability of voting methods, or the vulnerability of a voting rule to the strategic misrepresentation of members' preferences. And the key limitation there is that all the studies that we are aware of have focused on symmetric voters, so situations where all shareholders have an equal number of voting shares, let's say. So that's the starting point. I try to make the presentation very non-mathematical and hopefully visually enjoyable. For those who have been in the meeting last week, Manfred was complaining that biologists have so much nicer figures than economics, and this is better, more fruitful for open choice online publishing in biology compared to black and white economics. So we'll have colors today to compensate or change the issue, but let me nonetheless introduce a very little bit of notation. So I'll be talking about n different voters or players or voter groups, and they are to decide on m distinct alternatives, discrete alternatives. So typically m will be 3, 4, or 5. The voters are assumed to rank these alternatives strictly, so they all have a strict preference ordering, voter 1 to voter n, and if we combine them together, we obtain a preference profile indicated by a vote P. Our voting rule should determine or will determine for every given profile of preferences a winner, let's say A star, in accordance to some mechanisms such as plurality, so that A star is the alternative ranked first by the most voters, or plurality with runoff, where we have this runoff among the plurality leaders in case there's nobody having a majority in a plurality vote. Copeland rule would be a particular so-called Condorcet extension that is based on binary comparisons of all the candidates with each other, and in case there's a cycle, the alternative that beats the most others in a pairwise majority contest will be the one selected, and voter count assigns scores to all the candidates in accordance to how many respective candidates are ranked below the considered one. And then you sum that up, and A star is the alternative with the highest voter score. Combined any of these rules with some fixed tie-breaking rule in order to get a deterministic outcome where we mostly entirely consider lexicographic preferences. Formally speaking, a voting rule is a mapping, so from preference profiles to some winner. And it gets interesting when we combine one of these rules with voting weights or voting weight vector vote W, with the interpretation that now we apply the rule R, like plurality, not to the preferences in P, but sort of with some replication going on. Voter I's preferences are counted WI times. So the idea is that voter I really is a shareholder enjoying sort of WI votes because he or she is holding respecting voting shares, or it's a party whip with perfect party discipline, some group leader, some delegate of the economists or the lawyers, etc. And we thus obtain a new mapping that is somehow combining simple rule R with voting weights W. Now we saw earlier on that for given weights, different rules will give rise or can give rise to different winners. This is not always the case. For instance, if there have been just 2 candidates or applicants, then all the considered rules would have ended up with the same winner A star. So the rules would have been equivalent then if m equals 2, or they would have been equivalent if one of the groups had a sufficiently high weight. For instance, if sort of one group has more than 50% of the votes, it doesn't matter whether you use plurality with runoff, or pairwise comparisons. More generally, therefore, we are interested in whether the rule combined with weights W is the same or is something different with some potentially other rule R prime combined with W prime in a given context where the number m is critical. If 2 committees are equivalent in this sense that they give rise to the very same mapping from profiles to outcomes, then they obviously come with the same power distribution or the same distribution of expected preference satisfaction. This is what we refer to as success. They also have the same or come with the same manipulation opportunities or incentives, the same strategic voting equilibria, the same monotonicity properties, to some extent the same paradoxes, and so forth. So this is why it's interesting in our view to get a good idea about equivalence of committees. And we are not the first. This has long time been studied in the binary case for m equals 2. This goes back to the simple voting games and the theory of games in behavior by von Neumann and Morgenstern. But it becomes more fascinating yet, we believe, that if you have 3 or more alternatives, and then you possibly get different answers to the question, well, what's the effect of a party change in parliament or in some parliamentary committee? does reform of IMF drawing rights that induces a change in voting weights actually change anything, or do we still have the very same mapping from what the countries want to what is being done? And one can ask questions similar to the binary case: which rules may give the best incentives to buy voting shares, which are most transparent in the sense of aligning weights to the induced distribution of power, success, etc. So we started off, and that's the first part of the project. And I should say that I'm trying to give you an overview and a teaser of several papers with Sasha and Alex and some ongoing work. So in one of the papers we studied these equivalences. It's not the end of the story, but at the beginning. And we started with trying to simply count and then list the numbers of different games or different structurally different committees that arise when, let's say, you have two alternatives. These numbers actually are not new because the case of two alternatives, the dichotomous one, had been studied before. But, and as I said, all these rules amount to the same thing if there's just two alternatives. But so far nobody had bothered, as far as we know, about what happens if we have three alternatives and 3 or 4 or 5 alternatives, or 4 players, 4 groups and 3, 4, 5 alternatives, 5 voters, etc. And you see that the numbers here in this middle column, in the Copeland Condorcet rule column, if you like, even though other Condorcet rules in fact turn out to have different equivalence classes. So Copeland is not representative of all Condorcet rules. But you see that these numbers, 4, 9, 27, 138, are exactly the numbers we see up here. So it turns out if you just pick the winner based on the most pairwise wins, all the binary equivalences hold true. And so you can imagine the binary indices are good indices of power or success. But there's a difference. With plurality or border, the numbers rise much faster. So here we don't really have numbers, we just have lower bounds on the numbers. And overall, you see that differences in voting weights typically will affect the mapping and therefore distribution of power and so forth much more for border or for plurality when there's 3 or more alternatives than in the binary case, or if you use an entirely binary-based rule like Copeland. Behind these numbers, we also have, I mean, even though they're very cumbersome to communicate, lists of the respective committees in a minimal representation where we use the smallest possible integer voting weights to have a representative of all the committees that are equivalent to a given one. And at least for the small numbers that we show here, it's in principle possible to look up the respective underlying game, the minimum representation, and check whether 2 different weights do make a difference or not. And the nicest way to do so, at least in the case of 3 voters only, is actually graphical. And from now on, the rest of the presentation will be rather graphical. Before we start, let me remind you, and by the way, please feel free to post questions on the chat or interrupt me if I'm not clear enough. We will use for the geometric illustrations the standard projection of the simplex of voting weights distributed across 3 voters so that the relative voting weights of all 3 add up to 100%. So this point of the triangle up here corresponds to a committee where voter 3 has all the votes effectively or also nominally, and the others have 0. This point here would correspond to a situation where voter 2 and voter 3 have an equal vote share of 50%, but voter 1 has voting weight. And this point here in the very middle is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 distributed equally amongst the 3 voters. Maybe to make sure that you're still following, I don't see the pictures of your, I mean, I don't see the photos actually. Can anyone tell, maybe just turn on your microphone, what's special about this quadrilateral? So every point corresponds to a vector of 3 voting weights adding to 100, and there's something that makes this, you see my mouse, I hope. Anyone?
Number 1 has at least as much weight as each of the others.
Excellent. Okay, thanks. So this is the quadrilateral that represents voting configurations where player 1 is the biggest. So would be the plurality winner if plurality rule is used. Okay, so now I figured out where your faces are, and I can also see. Very good. Okay, so with that representation of different voting weight distributions in mind, we can now illustrate the only 4 different Copeland equivalence classes, structurally different committees. Any weight configuration illustrated here with the blue dot is one where one of the 3 players, and we don't really care about the labels, is a dictator, effectively has the only vote, and the others have nothing to say. So the outcome will correspond, if pairwise majority rule is used, to what voter 1 wants here, or voter 2 here, or voter 3 there. Another equivalence class of Copeland committees would be this yellow triangle in the middle. It's fairly big, many different weight configurations that all make the 3 voters symmetric players. Even if you look at this point up here, player 1 has fairly little vote, but as long as it's positive and nobody else has 50% or more, all 3 voters are equivalent. They're all the same, and you see the minimum sum integer representation would all give them 1 vote. And then we have a third class where voter 1 has exactly 50% and the others share the rest in some way. So in order to avoid ties, voter 1 has to team up with either of the other, but the other 2 cannot team up and decide on their own. And there's these special points where one of the 3 voters is a null player, has no say really, and the others are symmetric. So this is a graphical illustration of the 4 equivalent classes we knew before. And this is the same thing for plurality, and you see there it's pretty much different. The 3 voters are symmetric only really when they have exactly 1/3 of the voting weight. Otherwise, they fall in these classes indicated by 2-1-2 or 3-2-2. So you already get a sense there's a bit more to having a different weight than somebody else under plurality than under Copeland. And this gets more extreme if we look at border committees. So 3 players deciding on 3 alternatives now by using the border scoring method. And it's actually not really, you can't see all the 51 different colors properly, I assume, but these are the equivalence classes then. And it gets even nicer. I find it almost an art, sort of the hidden beauty of voting with 4 alternatives and with 5 alternatives. So this is an illustration, and if 2 points have the same color, they would correspond to the same majority, or not majority really with border, but the same mapping from preference profiles to winners. And you see border is different from the others. For the others, it's also possible to get some fancier pictures, and many thanks to Alex, who has compiled these graphs just in time. If we look at 4 voters, then obviously it's no longer just a triangle illustrating the voting weight configurations, sort of projecting a 3-dimensional simplex into the plane, but we're projecting a 4-dimensional simplex into a tetrahedra. And then you can try to slice this up into different equivalence classes, a bit like this. I mean, we're still working on how to communicate this better, but I guess you get the idea. So now, once we have identified 2 committees that are not the same, that are structurally different, non-equivalent, then you might ask which one is better from the perspective of, let's say, a power maximizing player. So how does rule change shift the power distribution? How does the effect of changing weights, as happened, for instance, in the International Monetary Fund Executive Board, to changing the rule that they use to decide on 3 or more alternatives? And other rules, other questions, which rules align weights and power the most closely, etc. For this, you need some sense of quantifying or some measure of that quantifies influence power in such a weighted committee. And one way to go would be to work with these minimums integer sum representation and take these as indications of power. This has been proposed for binary games, but there's some problems to it. And we therefore prefer to follow other proposals in the literature on binary voting and generalize the so-called Penrose-Banzhaf index, the Shapley-Shubik index, or other indices which all quantify influence as the expected sensitivity of the outcome, what the committee decides, to voter I. So looking at the odds for voter I's vote to have made a difference to the outcome. If I had decided differently, had different preferences, a different outcome would have obtained. What's the probability of that? This is then either the Penrose-Banzhaf index for a particular probability distribution over preferences, or the Shapley-Shubik index for another probability distribution over preferences. And we follow this route, or in other words, we construct a power index for social choice function or weighted committees by doing a simple thought experiment in analogy to what Shapley-Shubik, Penrose, and Banzhaf have done. So we draw a preference profile P at random and identify the outcome, A star. Then we want to investigate the power of some player I. We vary that player's preferences. We perturb PI to some different PI tilde and check again what is the winning outcome now. And if the two are different, then player I has been a swing voter for A star. And we repeat the exercise, and in each case, take I being a swing voter as I has influence on the committee decision at the preference profile at hand, and adding up or taking expectations for a particular probability distribution over preference profiles, and assuming, this is we do throughout, these perturbations to be all equally likely, then we obtain player I's a priori voting power, just as you do in the binary case for more general weighted committees. Note that we don't take a stance on where the perturbations should come from. This could be sort of a spontaneous change of mind, the result of log rolling or being bribed, last minute new information, a tremble or mistake, or sort of simply expressing I have the power. The key premise is just that a committee member is more influential in the committee, the more the output, so to speak, the decision varies in the decision process, the more sort of the input induces swings or variations result in different outcomes. A remark on this, well, perturbations, they are directionless. This is the key difference also to manipulability or manipulation, where the assumption is that a player strategically submits different preferences to reach an outcome A star that is judged better relative to the original PI preferences which are maintained. We just say, well, suppose the guy has different preferences. Would this make a difference? This is all we want for power indications rather than studying manipulability, which we'll also do in the end. So assuming now, as the Penrose-Banzhaf, or making the impartial culture assumption that all preference profiles are equally likely, we obtain a power index where a value of 0.25 for player I signifies that a priori 25% of I's preference variation would change the outcome. So there's a direct interpretation. There's one caveat to this. When we're talking about 3 or more alternatives, many perturbations won't change the outcome, even if the respective player has 100% of the power, because the guy is a dictator and the only one with positive weight in the minimal representation. So we also construct another index by normalizing this one such that a dictator always has a power of 1. And a null player who never influences the outcome automatically for both will have a power value of 0. So that a power indication of 0.5 means, well, ice power is exactly halfway between being a null player and a dictator player. And when making alternative probability assumption, for instance, impartial anonymous culture, we obtain a generalization of the Shapley-Shubik rather than the Penrose-Banzhaf or yet other indices by yet other probability distributions. And the referees keep insisting, I mean, especially those with a cooperative game theory background, they want axiomatizations of the measures we construct, and at least luckily some of the axiomatizations from the binary case, they carry over. But just a small fraction of them, unfortunately. Okay, but I don't want to go into technical details, but rather show you one application. What can you do with it? And let's take the International Monetary Fund as our target. It has been the object of a number of studies in the binary framework by Fuad, Aleskero, Dennis Leach, some others. There was a big quota reform in quotation marks in 2016 that also clarified that when the executive board is to select the managing director, so Karolina Georgieva at the moment, and before it was Christine Lagarde, it should do so from a shortlist of 3 candidates by a majority of the votes cast. The votes cast, they are related by some deterministic formula to the drawing rights that IMF member states have. So that's well defined. But what's open in our view, and the fund, when we emailed them, didn't want to be more precise on this. What is a majority when you have 3 candidates, or if nobody has a majority among 3 candidates, which is very easily the case? So are they using plurality rule then? Or maybe a runoff between the plurality leaders or pairwise comparisons? With the indices we've constructed, it is possible to check for all these rules whether they would make a difference. Using them might be the very same thing as using another. It also allows to check which of the rules might be the one that gives the US or Germany or some emerging economies the most power. So this is what we have done in one of the papers, and here you see the vote shares before and after the reform. So the main change has been that China has been given a lot more drawing rights and a lot more voting weight, whereas sort of the old European powers, Germany, France, UK, etc., they have lost voting weight. And then you can do the computations and ask, how do the new voting weights affect the distribution of power, depending on which rule, plurality runoff, or pairwise comparisons is being used. And obviously the power for China goes up, and I don't want to go into details here, but focus on sort of just the new weights after the reform, which was very hard fought over. So it took over 10 years to change the quotas, and the US Congress initially refused to ratify the changes and so forth. So there was a big fuss about going to these weights. But here we just look at the current status quo situation, the weights, but compare the different procedures for selecting among 3 candidates, like a successor to Georgieva. And there it turns out that there's a very simple pattern. The US, as the biggest player, has the greatest power under plurality compared to Copeland or plurality runoff. Whereas for all the others, all the other board members have the most influence on outcome using plurality runoff, and the least using plurality. So there's a clear size bias, if you want, in the case of the IMF deciding on 3 alternatives. And what's even more curious to observe is that the differences between the rules, like this 70 versus 66, 67, or 19 versus 22, these differences are actually bigger than the differences between pre and post weights. So the thing that was haggled over intensively has less consequence when it comes to this a priori power than fixing one of these rules and making sure that it either serves the US's interests or those of the others when you equate interest with influence. What we can do as well is sort of more generally, not just for one particular case like the IMF, check if plurality always favors the largest voter. We might give general rule recommendations what to do in order to maximize or minimize the influence of a particular voter, or answer the question which rule is most transparent in minimizing the distance with some norm like L1 norm between relative weight and influence. This has been something of interest for the binary case in the European Union's Council, or the Council of Ministers. And the same can be done for 3 or more alternatives with the indices suggested here. I just give you a snapshot of comparing the influence or the power of player 1 under plurality rule versus Copeland or plurality runoff rule. And remember, this quadrilateral, that was the this represented the weight distribution where player 1 is the biggest players, and yellow indicates no change, same power. The respective largest player is a dictator under any of the rules, but this green area indicates plurality gives player 1 strictly more influence, and red indicates strictly less influence for player 1. So the message of this picture would be that if you are the largest among 3 groups, like the law guys in our hiring committee or in our prize committee, you should determine the winner based on plurality rule. But turns out that plurality is not always the best in terms of maximizing influence for the largest group. This is comparing plurality to border, and you see that in this quadrilateral there's a lot of green but also some red area. So border rule can actually give the largest voter more influence than plurality. You might also figure out from player 1's perspective which rule is actually maximizing my influence. This is all the result of long computation. So this is a study in computational social choice, if you like. So generating the data to show you this picture is quite laborious. But after you've done it, in a way, next time you have to chair a committee where you think there's 3 relatively homogeneous groups, you might want to look at this map and install the rule that maximizes your group's influence. If, however, you are the institutional designer and you want the greatest alignment in L1 norm between voting weights or relative voting weights and relative voting power, turns out that either all 3 rules are the same, or this light blue area is where border is the best. So that's all on influence. For the last minutes, let's briefly look at other criteria like expected preference satisfaction or success, where you might give utility to achieving your top rank, your second rank, etc., assuming equal differences between ranks, or you just look at the probability to get your own top alternative win, or manipulability, that is the probability to benefit or the expected benefit from preference misrepresentation under the assumption that only player 1 is smart and has figured out the other's preferences, etc. That would be sort of an individual measure of manipulability, or you could look at generally what's the probability that sincere voting is a Nash equilibrium, or that at least one voter can gain from lying, the expected number of voters that could gain from lying, and so forth. Well, in the binary case, this is all not so interesting because you never want to manipulate, and success is a linear transformation of power under the impartial culture assumption. But it gets interesting, as so often, for 3 or more alternatives. And then you might even have situations where switching to new weights or adopting a new voting procedure may raise some players' power and at the same time lower the expected preference satisfaction, or vice versa. These are exceptions, however. So mostly, as we reran the computations for the IMF, for instance, or for the best rule, mostly the results are similar. Or even get stronger. So the differences between the rules are even bigger that difference between differences between rules and between old and new weights. They have more relevance for the rules for now 23 out of 24 board members, all except China, whereas before it was only for 20 out of 24 that my statement was true, that the rule actually matters more than the weight reform. On manipulability, so some final pictures on that. The studies I mentioned earlier, they have considered 1 of 3 indices usually. The Kelly index is the probability of at least some voter being able to gain from misrepresenting preferences, or the probability of a tainted profile, as it's called. You might also ask, what is, for tainted profiles, what is the number of tempted voters who could gain from misrepresenting, assuming only they are smart? Or looking at a specific voter, you might look at how much could player I, if the guy is smart and strategic, could improve his or her lot relative to sincere voting. So that's the ratio between the optimal improvement if player I strategizes in the best possible way relative to the baseline distance between sincere voting outcome and player I's top. And previous studies, as I said, have all been restricted to equal weights, but other than they could cope with large N and M, which we can't. But so far, we only knew these 24% applying to all three voters having the same voting weight or being symmetric in a committee. And these earlier studies have usually indicated that border is performing particularly badly in terms of manipulability, and moving to three alternatives and having three alternatives, but moving to asymmetric voters, different weights, you see the situation gets even much worse. We move to a Kelly index, so proportion of tainted profiles of up to 50%. This is much worse than for plurality. So plurality is much more robust with respect to manipulation, or you could say sincere voting is much more likely to be a Nash equilibrium. And it turns out that actually the best amongst the considered rules in terms of manipulability in our set is plurality with runoff. It's everywhere tied or even the unique least manipulable voting rule, both looking at the Kelly index and this multiplicity weighted measure where you look at the expected number of manipulators. For player one, again, we can draw a map. If player one is very strategic, then manipulation tends to be good, and border rule gives him or her the greatest leeway. Okay, these are the papers that the presentation was based on. I can try if I can draw them into the chat, but Gregor said that probably this is not going to work. So if you're interested in getting one of them, just drop me a line, and I said whatever you want, and plus some current work. Manipulability is still very fresh and was not even a working paper. So to conclude, the upshot is that the main take-home message is that the adopted voting procedures matters not just for given preferences, as numerous excellent talk by Hannu Nurmi, but also papers by Wolfgang Leinier, Tabarrok, Spector, Maskin, Sen have indicated. So big decisions like Berlin versus Bonn, or the US Civil War, or the election of Donald Trump, they have all been influenced, so it has been argued, by what voting procedure was used, and some alternative outcome might have prevailed with a different procedure. But we show that also from an a priori perspective, ex ante, not yet knowing what are the preferences of the voters, of the members of the German Bundestag, the voting procedure quantifiably affects the distribution of influence, success, and manipulability. That's it. If you have suggestions, I will be very happy. In particular, suggestions for other institutions where you have both weights. We have that in lots of shareholder corporations, but also codified rules for how to deal with three options. We have that for the IMF, but we find it in many Aktiengesellschaften or none. But let me stop now and take your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you. It's very, very thought-provoking indeed. I suppose that I'm supposed to be a chairman now, or is that okay? Then the floor is open now for questions or comments, please.